3 true Skinwalker Ranch horror stories. Skeptical of all the bizarre stories surrounding Skinwalker Ranch, I agreed to join a small research team planning an overnight visit. It felt ridiculous to believe in skinwalkers and shapeshifters, but part of me was curious to see what we'd find. When we arrived, the air felt colder than usual for that time of year, with an unsettling stillness hanging over the landscape. The day passed uneventfully as we set up our equipment and documented the area. We hoped to capture something, anything, that might explain the strange tales. But it wasn't until dusk, as the last light began to drain from the sky, that I noticed something odd on a distant ridge. A figure tall and unnaturally thin stood motionless, watching us. I squinted, trying to make out details, but it was too far away. Just as I was about to dismiss it as a trick of the light, it moved. Its head tilted in a slow, deliberate way, almost as if it was considering us. My stomach dropped. I whispered to the others, and we all turned to look. There was something profoundly unsettling about the figure, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows, as if it weren't fully solid. One of my colleagues raised his hand in a hesitant wave, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to descend the ridge, moving in a strange, gliding motion that was both graceful and disturbing. I could hardly breathe as I watched it, transfixed. With each step, it seemed to shift slightly in shape. One moment, it appeared human, with limbs and a head. The next, it seemed animalistic, like a wolf or coyote, though distorted in ways I couldn't explain. The entire team was frozen in place, watching as it got closer and closer, until it was only about 100 yards away. Suddenly, it stopped and shifted again, this time crouching low to the ground. Its face tilted upward, revealing eyes that glowed an unnatural, piercing yellow. I felt an instinctual fear rise in me, every fiber of my being telling me to run. But I couldn't look away. Those eyes held me captive, drawing me in with a strange, hypnotic pull. As we stood there, the creature began to change shape again, its body contorting, stretching, and shrinking in a way that defied physics. My colleague, who'd been silent up to this point, finally broke down and whispered, That's not possible." His voice was barely audible, thick with fear. Then, the creature let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that was laced with something almost human, a kind of mocking laughter. My colleague stumbled backward, breaking the spell, and we all took a few steps back, our senses snapping into survival mode. The figure began to move faster, a blur of shapes that defied reason. First running on 2 legs, then 4, then back to 2, its form shifting in ways that defied all logic. It circled us, staying just beyond the edges of our flashlights, moving so fast that I could barely keep track of it. It was like it was toying with us, waiting for us to break. My heart pounded as I fumbled with my flashlight, trying to catch a glimpse of the thing. But each time, it evaded the beam, blending back into the shadows. And then it stopped again, just on the other side of our campsite, watching us from the darkness. With a sudden, unnatural speed, it lunged forward, stopping inches from my face. I stumbled back, barely catching myself before I fell. The creature was so close I could see the grotesque details of its twisted face, eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. Its skin seemed to ripple and shift, as though it were made of smoke and shadows, constantly reforming into new shapes. Finally, I heard the voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. "You don't belong here." The words sent a chill down my spine, each syllable dripping with malice. It stepped back, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had come. But the voice lingered, echoing in my mind long after the creature was gone. We didn't dare sleep that night. Instead, we packed up as quietly as we could, waiting for the first light of dawn before making our way back to the car. Every few minutes, I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature watching us, its shifting form melting into the trees. But the forest remained silent, as if holding its breath. When we finally reached the car, we threw our things inside, desperate to leave that place behind. As we drove away, I felt a heavy sense of dread. as if we were being followed, though nothing was visible in the rearview mirror. I'll never forget that feeling, the knowledge that we had encountered something that defied reason, something ancient and malevolent that had watched us, taunted us, and let us leave only because it chose to. This next story is bone-chilling, so make sure to watch until the end. I was a seasoned livestock researcher working on cases of unusual behavior near Skinwalker Ranch. Locals had reported strange occurrences, from cattle disappearing without a trace to eerie sightings in the fields. Skeptical of anything supernatural, I approached my assignment scientifically. I was certain these phenomena had rational explanations: predators, natural hazards, or perhaps foul play. One evening, I set up my observation post near a small herd, positioned at the edge of the ranch. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a thick fog began to creep in from the fields, casting an ominous veil over everything. The cattle, which had been grazing peacefully, suddenly froze, their heads turning in unison to face a single direction. They stared intently into the gathering mist, bodies tense, almost as if they sensed something invisible moving within the fog. I strained my eyes, trying to see what had caught their attention. That's when I noticed the shadow. At first, it was subtle, just a faint, indistinct shape moving through the fog. But as it approached, it grew larger and more defined. I held my breath, watching in disbelief as a figure slowly emerged from the mist. A tall, lanky shape with limbs that were too long and a gait that didn't seem quite human. It moved toward the herd with a strange, gliding motion, its feet barely touching the ground. As it drew closer, I could see that it didn't walk so much as flow across the field, like smoke taking form. The cattle began to stir, their fear evident in the way they shifted and huddled together, emitting low, distressed moans that filled the night air. I was rooted in place, unable to look away as the figure continued its silent approach. Then, without warning, the creature stopped. Its head turned slowly in my direction, and I felt a cold chill spread through my body as its gaze locked onto me. Though it was difficult to make out details, I could see its eyes, a pair of glowing orbs that radiated a sickly yellow light, cutting through the fog like beams in the darkness. They weren't human, those eyes. They held a darkness that seemed to pierce through me, filling me with a primal fear I couldn't shake. The figure raised one long arm, pointing directly at me. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever this thing was. But I was paralyzed, my mind racing, grappling with the impossibility of what I was witnessing. The creature held its stance for what felt like an eternity, its unnatural eyes locked on mine, its silent, menacing presence casting a suffocating tension over the field. Then, it turned its attention back to the cattle. With an eerie, flowing movement, it slipped into the herd, weaving between the animals like a ghost passing through walls. Panic spread through the cattle as they scattered, their frantic movements filling the air with the sound of thundering hooves and desperate lowing. I watched, helpless, as one by one, the cattle vanished into the fog, their forms swallowed up by the dense mist. When the fog finally lifted, there was nothing left. The field was empty, not a single hoofprint, no signs of a struggle, only the stillness of the night and the lingering dread that clung to the air. I stumbled back to my post, my mind reeling. The other researchers would never believe me. There was no proof, no physical evidence, nothing but the memory of that figure, that unnatural gaze and the eerie silence that settled after the herd disappeared. I returned to the main camp at dawn, the event replaying in my mind over and over, each detail etched into my memory with haunting clarity. As I sat alone gathering my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen was still watching me, somewhere out there in the mist, waiting for its next move. Skinwalker Ranch had always fascinated me. For years, I'd heard whispers of strange encounters and unexplainable events surrounding that eerie place. So, as a paranormal investigator, visiting the ranch was a dream and a risk. The air felt different as soon as my team and I arrived, thick and charged, almost humming with energy. I told myself it was just nerves, but there was something else there, a presence that seemed to linger in the shadows. We set up our equipment near a canyon, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the barren landscape. Night fell quickly, and the stars seemed unusually bright against the empty, sprawling sky. It was about an hour into the investigation when I noticed a light flickering in the canyon below. At first, I assumed it was a piece of our equipment reflecting, but as I watched, I realized the light was moving, gliding back and forth in an irregular, almost curious manner. I pointed it out to the others, and we decided to investigate, drawn deeper into the canyon. As we approached, the light split into multiple points, 3 bright orbs that floated in eerie silence. They moved around us in slow, hypnotic arcs, seeming to watch us. My teammate whispered that he felt a vibration in his chest, a low hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. I held my breath, unsure whether it was a trick of the mind or if something in the canyon was genuinely alive, observing us. Suddenly, the lights flared brighter, almost blindingly so, and an intense ringing filled my ears, vibrating through my entire body. Shadows shifted around us in strange, unnatural ways, twisting into forms that looked disturbingly human, but somehow wrong. I could make out limbs and faces, but they were misshapen, elongated, as if made of shadows that had taken form just for that moment. It felt like they were whispering, voices just on the edge of hearing, a language that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the lights vanished, plunging us into absolute darkness. The shadows melted back into the night, leaving us standing in silence, our breaths echoing in the still air. It felt like the canyon itself was holding its breath, and for a moment I thought I could feel it watching us, aware and waiting. None of us dared move. We just stood there, letting our eyes adjust, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. One of my teammates finally broke the silence, whispering that we needed to leave, and we stumbled back toward our base camp. But as we walked, I realized that the humming sound had returned, faint but growing louder with each step. It was coming from the canyon, a low, pulsing rhythm that seemed to follow us, as if whatever we had encountered didn't want us to leave. I felt eyes on me, not human, not animal, but something else entirely, something ancient. The sound persisted until we reached our camp, only fading as we packed up our things in silence. None of us spoke about what we'd seen. We were too shaken, too disturbed by the unspoken understanding that we'd come face to face with something beyond human comprehension. As we drove away, the lights appeared again, hovering at the edge of the canyon, watching us until we disappeared into the distance. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please remember to like and subscribe for more videos like this one.